Today on The Nation Speaks, pornography, the addiction nobody wants to talk about, but it's wildly destructive and almost every child is exposed to it. Porn addiction recovery coach and podcaster Jaco Emezi explains what no parent wants to hear. Then in America Q&A, we ask if you think pornography is harmful to people who watch it. Next, looking at porn from the other side. What's the truth behind the porn industry? Anti-sex trafficking advocate Jaco Booyens exposes how it's all connected. Finally, in our second America Q&A, are you worried about monkeypox? Hello and welcome to The Nation Speaks. I'm your host, Cindy Drucare. Today, pornography and porn addiction. It's a topic that's generally shunned in polite society, but it's so rampant and so deeply harmful that we have to bring it out from the shadows. On the one hand, representations of sex are completely normalized. They're literally everywhere, on billboards, TV shows, video games, social media platforms, Super Bowl halftime shows, and sex education classrooms. On the other hand, barely anyone talks about porn as a drug, a highly addictive drug that destroys relationships, brain functions, values, and by extension, society, or how the porn industry itself relies on human sex trafficking, including of children. We have two guests today who have a lot to say on these subjects. Joining us now is Jaco Emezi, a pornography addiction recovery coach. JK, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Before you started helping others, you were addicted to pornography yourself. Tell us a bit of your journey. How did it start for you?
Thanks for asking, Cindy. I've shared this story quite a bit. My first exposure to pornography, unfortunately, was at the age of 8. I ended up finding a pornographic magazine that was hidden by our nanny at the time. My parents were in the medical field and they were gone all day. And as a kid who hadn't hit puberty, it was just really shocking. So I knew it was something bad and wrong, and I'd probably get in trouble for it. But I had never been spoken to about it. So we didn't speak much about sex in our home. So there was just this chemical reaction I experienced, excitement, the taboo nature of it. And I just kept going back whenever I had the opportunity. When I hit puberty, about 13, 14 years old, and I discovered masturbation, that was when I realized I equated pornography to something really good. And unfortunately, as I went through my teenage years, I started using pornography as a coping mechanism. So breakups, rejections, bullies at school, anything that happened, low grades, bad grades, I could count on pornography to make me feel better. And over the years, that had a very negative impact on my life.
When did you say to yourself, maybe I'm addicted and have a problem with this?
When I was about 17 years old, and it was my first year in college, I realized that I was spending an inordinate amount of time on pornography. Like I could start at 10 p.m. at night and keep watching pornography till about 3 a.m. in the morning. Sounds crazy, but there are a lot of men, unfortunately, today who do that. When I realized that I was spending my money on chat rooms with women to see them naked, and a few times I hit my credit limit on my card, and I couldn't pay my rent, and I had to reach out to my mom and tell her that my account was overdrawn again. So I would say it was a gradual process. You know, parents asking me what was wrong, always being broke, not having a dating life. And eventually, I started experiencing some of the physical side effects. One of those things is called, I didn't know what it was then, but it's PIED, which is porn-induced erectile dysfunction, which meant that I could not have normal, intimate situation with a real-life human partner. I only could when I was viewing pornography virtually.
And is the addiction part something you ever talked about with your peers or heard about from any source?
That's the interesting thing about struggling with something like this. due to the shame and the stigma that's attached to pornography and certain sexual behaviors, it's very difficult to talk to anyone about it. In fact, one of the characteristics of pornography addiction is the shame that you experience, because in your head, you think that everybody else watches it and it's so pervasive, but you feel that you're the only one who is not able to control yourself. And that makes you feel quite helpless. So it wasn't until I stumbled across a forum many years later with literally hundreds of thousands of guys who were struggling with this. And it shocked me to realize that there were so many people struggling with it. And also, I think it's also important to kind of define pornography. And that definition keeps changing. It's basically anything that could, a visual that could stimulate you sexually.
We're joined now by Jaco Booyens, an anti-sex trafficking advocate and filmmaker. Jaco, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
We learned from our last guest how widespread pornography consumption is and how it's not really talked about as a social problem. Another thing that's not really talked about is the creation of pornography itself. A lot of people think it's made by, consenting actors who are paid for their work, so no harm done. Is that true?
Absolutely not. How it actually works, in fact, is we know that 80% of what we call mainstream porn are actually women who are placed there by their traffickers because they're not reaching their money quota. And so this is abuse. And the notion that porn doesn't hurt people, it hurts everybody. It hurts the user the most, and they just don't know it. But it's force, fraud, and coercion. It's violent. They don't know about the ER visits. And the drugs and the forced abortions that these porn actresses go through. And so if you look at the brothel society in Las Vegas, over 90% of what would be called prostitutes in legal brothels have claimed rape cases through porn, where they are forced to perform acts that they don't want to perform.
What about when it comes to children? One of the things we were talking about earlier is how young kids are exposed to pornography. Now the average age is 8 years old. Even in 2016, it was 11. What about on the other side? Just to throw a stat out there, in an analysis of 130,000 porn titles, teen was the most common word used.
Yeah, absolutely. Teen is the most common word used. Why is that? Because evil has no end. It doesn't. And sexual immorality does not have a bottom. And so people on that track, it's like a drug. You don't start with heroin, you start with an opioid and you work your way towards heroin. Well, it's always leading towards prepubescent children, porn with children, sex with children. And our culture has normalized the notion of what is rape? What is abuse? We just did a study where we showed, and talked about rape to teenage boys, and they said, what's wrong with that? Because they see it every single day. Because remember now, when I was in high school in the mid-90s, if you wanted porn, you had to go sneak into a gas station with a fake ID, buy a book that's behind a black cover, and the worst it was going to be is probably Pamela Anderson without her top on a motorcycle. It's porn. Today, the first porn that a child sees is gang rape. It's violent. And so their idea of love, intimacy is shattered in a minute. And you do understand that porn is the only drug on earth that physically changes the neural pathways of the brain. It alters your human state. It's not like it's alcohol that's external or a drug that if you don't touch it, it's away from you. Sex is internal. So the desire